about 3 minutes in now, so I'll make a start on this question Voltique, and I do hope you've all had a good chance to have a look at it. And I've got the question here on the left. I wrote this question and I tried to incorporate a few things into it whilst I was writing it. So one of the things I did is I made the split between calculations and non-calculations about half and half. That's quite heavy on calculations. You probably won't get more than half of the marks allocated for calculations in a Section C question. So that's kind of the maximum I would expect. Although obviously the examiners can do what they want in terms of how they split it. But I've gone for a stronger calculation question here. And I hope when you looked through it, you thought it was long. I deliberately went for a long question. And again, this is kind of about the maximum I would expect for a PM question. On the whole, you would generally get less than this, but I just wanted to push those boundaries because I think it's good to test our boundaries. So we're not faced with shocks and surprises too much in the exam. One of the skills we need to develop when we're doing Section C questions is knowing what to ignore and when, and then what to take account of and when. And hopefully when you were reading through this, you saw that there was this new product line, which wasn't related to any part of Part A and was all related to Part B and wasn't related to the other part. So when you've got a lot of information, do try and work out where it belongs, where it doesn't belong. And the way I would do this, I would always look at the requirements first. You see I've highlighted some key points, but I would start with the requirements before I even start to read any of that information. Because what I'm doing is creating context then. I know that the first part of the question is preparing a rolling budget. So then as I start to look through the question, I'm starting to think to myself, oh, that's part of the rolling budget information. And I highlight the relevant bits. And other bits I'd read, nothing to do with the rolling budget, so I need to put those in another category. So I'm just going to go through and do the question. I won't write every single word out. I've also got some points I want to make as I'll go through, and I'll just pick those up as I go along. And I'd like to thank anyone that did send a WhatsApp message where they were stuck or had a question on this. That's great. And what I'll do is I'll try and incorporate those as I go through. I'll answer those as I go through. And I've got a list of those questions, and I'll just check those at the end to make sure I've covered all of those. I'm not going to do you the disservice of sitting and reading this out to you because it's not really a good use of your time, but I just want to pick up the things I've highlighted. So requirement A, which is 6 marks, always take note of how many marks it is, because that should give you an indication of, for a calculation, how complicated it is or how many steps you need to do. And for a narrative question like C, D, and E, it should give you an idea of the amount you should be writing. It's not an exact science, but certainly an indication. I hope it goes without saying that a 6-mark narrative question, Part C, or question C, would probably have about 3 times the amount of content as Part E, which is 2 marks. So looking at A, we need to prepare the rolling budget for 4 quarters. Make sure we do 4 quarters ending March 2066. And it tells us the smart lock is not yet in production and should not be included. For B, which is 3 marks, we need to calculate the labour cost of producing the second batch to help with the proposed launch. C, as a discussion, we need to find 3 weaknesses of the current budgeting process. And then for each weakness, identify the extent to which rolling budgets would address it. Every so often I'm pausing, I'm sorry, because I'm just seeing people still entering the waiting room, so I want to admit them. So if I pause, it's probably because I've just seen something pop up on my other screen. So back to Part C, if we've got 3 weaknesses and how rolling budget could help, you'd expect a weakness and how it helps to be a mark each, that's 2 marks, and then we've got 3 lots of those. Part D, we're looking at the difficulties of changing to a new system of rolling budgets. Difficulties of change is a common question in PM, and some of them are quite generic, but what we need to do is use those generic challenges of change and make sure we link them to the question that's being asked. And then part E, 2 marks, explain 2 ways in which ERP system and data analytic capabilities could be used to improve. Now, the reason I put this in was a very specific reason. What we're seeing from the examining team is an increased emphasis in the comments they're making and changes to the syllabus on 2 main areas, data and the environment and sustainability. So what you might find if you look back at past paper questions, you may not see these characteristics or these questions that ask about data and ask about sustainability and environment. I would expect more and more of that to come up as we go forward. So that's why I've included a bit there, just so kind of predicting, crystal ball gazing, should we say, to see what the examiner might start to introduce more and more. And also, as you're probably aware, the syllabus changes September next year, and there's a heavier data component in that as well. So I'm just sort of predicting what the examiner might start to move closer and closer towards. I don't think we're going to see whole questions around data or whole questions around sustainability, but I do think we're going to start to see a bit more introduced, and that's why I've got that there. I've also been through and I've highlighted key points. Now, the reason I think it's important to highlight key points is the examining team generally take a lot of time and effort and energy to put things into a question, and they rarely put things in that they don't want you to pick up on. So this process of going through and highlighting key points, this can help you, particularly if you get stuck on something to say. Hopefully your highlighted area you might look at and think, well, I haven't commented on that. What was the examiner looking for me? And it can help looking at from me. And it can help you create an answer or create a little bit of narrative around that point. Make sure it's relevant. Make sure you're answering the question. But this is a good way to mop up a few extra marks which you may have otherwise missed. So the key things I've highlighted, we've got a rapid market or a market that grew rapidly initially, but then bigger, better funded competitors now means that selling prices and costs have become more volatile. This company, Voltique, they use a fixed annual budget, which they do on a quarterly basis. But as it says, it's set between October and December. And the budget is for the year to December. So they're starting to do their budgeting process in October based on the previous year's budget, not even the previous year's actuals. So any issues with the previous year are carried forward into the next year. So that's a key thing to pick up there, that they're basing it on budget. So each year the budget will probably get further and further away from actuals, and that's a real problem with this form of budget setting. And what they do is they take the previous year budget, adjust for inflation or expected inflation. There's no involvement of functional managers, so you're less likely to get buy-in. They're just given their budget in December. It doesn't get changed over the year if conditions change. And then they are not only evaluated on how well they achieve that budget, they get a bonus or don't get a bonus, depending on whether they achieve it or not. And then we've got this next bit here. Again, do look out for this. If it gives an example of a problem, something's gone wrong, that's a really important thing to try and pick up in our narrative. So here we've got that the targets became unrealistic because of competition. And what happened? The sales director introduced a large discount. So that's damaged margins and has made it harder to bring those prices back up to the level they were before. So one big problem there. And the second problem is this 4 million expansion, which was based on original budgeted sales, didn't take into account all of these changes. And so that capacity, the 4 million expansion, is effectively wasted, or at least in part wasted. And then this is another thing we see quite often, a new member of staff. So here we've got a new FD who wants to change things. So that's always that's often a thing we see in the questions. This FD's made some comments. They've said the budgets are out of date as soon as they're approved. I think we would agree if they're setting them in October to start in January the next year. and they're based on the previous year's budget, which itself is based on the previous year budget. I think that's a very valid comment. They want to move to rolling budgets, which are updated quarterly. And also talked about using the data capabilities for this ERPS, which has this functionality, real-time sales dashboards, data analytic tools, external market data feeds, but they're not using all of it. They're just using it to process routine accounting transactions. So they've invested a lot here. They're not making the most of it. We've obviously got the figures here and we've got some assumptions, but we've also down here got some changes to those assumptions. So we could take those assumptions at the top in context of what's down the bottom here. So the original assumption was sales revenue would grow at 4% compounded each quarter. But because of the change, it's now 2% expected each quarter. Gross profit margin would remain stable each quarter, so we can work out what the gross profit margin percentage is from the above. And it tells us that there was a fall in the gross profit margin because of raw material prices, and that's expected to be permanent. So therefore, we should use the actual figure down below rather than the budgeted up above. The assumption around selling and distribution was that it would remain a fixed percentage of revenue, and it says here that that remains valid. Same for admin costs, would be fixed each quarter, and that remains valid. And then we've also got all of this question around, or all of this information around the new product line, which all feeds into part B, which is a learning curve calculation. A lot of people don't like learning curves, but hopefully I'll show you a way during this session using the spreadsheet, which I think is a very efficient way to do a learning curve calculation. But let's just go through what we're told. So they're considering launching a new product which would be produced quarterly, and none of the information is reflected above. So it's a completely standalone question, completely separate to the budget question. They've done this pilot batch, which took 8,000 hours. It's highly labour intensive, which is what lends itself to a learning curve or a learning improvement in labour time because of the learning effect. And so an 80% learner rate applied. They've told us the value of B, so we don't need to do that calculation. It's told us that B is minus 0.321928. And the labour rate is 12 per hour. And the finance director has also made a comment on how rolling budgets will also be a better choice if they do introduce this new product. So there's a lot there on purpose. Like I said earlier, I would be surprised actually if you got this much information in a Section C question, and what you might end up is they might actually split it. So it could be that this new product bit just sits before part B rather than being up the top here. Okay, so let's take a look. You could do these questions in any order. You could start with whichever one you prefer, and I would recommend doing that. You don't have to do them in order, and it's not advisable to do them in order. Let's say you hate learning curves. What you should probably do is make sure you've done A, C, D, and E before you even start on B. So you're getting the easier marks or the lower hanging fruit before you try and get the more difficult ones. Because when you run out of time, you should allocate time to do a question. And when you've used up that time, you should stop. There's no point carrying on if you've used up your time, because what you're trying to do is get the harder marks where there's probably easier marks elsewhere. Now, we tend to say something like 1.8 minutes per mark. So for a 20 mark Section C question, you typically want to spend about 36 minutes. I will do them in order because I just think it's easier to follow what I'm doing, but you certainly don't have to. So the first part is we need to prepare the rolling budget for 4 quarters ending 31st of March 2066. So I've just set up a spreadsheet here Sometimes you're given the template, which obviously helps and makes it more efficient in the exam. Try to be efficient with your spreadsheet work. Don't write very long labels. Don't spend too long trying to format it, trying to make it look pretty. You won't get any additional marks for making it look pretty, but certainly do try and make it clear as to what you are showing here. So I need to show the rolling budget ended March 2066. So I've put the wrong date on there. March 2066. And the easiest way I think to do a rolling budget is to take what they've given us, and they've given us the layout, put in the actuals for Q1, and then use that to help calculate Q2, Q3, Q4, and very importantly, Q1 of the next year. I'm just copying and pasting that so we can see we've got 4 budget columns and 1 actual column. It is in thousands, so I will put that up the top there. They've got it all the way along here, but I don't want to type things out unnecessarily. As long as I've got it somewhere, that's good enough. And so I'm going to just use some abbreviations here. So revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, selling and distribution, admin, and operating profit. So you've seen I've used some shorthand there. I do want to be efficient. So 9,600 there, 5,568 there. Now what I would do is I would use the functionality of the spreadsheet to do the gross profit and the operating profit for me, because then if I've made a typo here, it should pick it up. And I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to put lines in. The exam platform is a bit tricky to try and put lines in and borders in the spreadsheet. I just use Control B. I think that's good enough. And then my selling and distribution is 480 and admin 1150. Once again, I'm doing a sum of those 3. It matches what I've got down here, the 2402, so I'm quite comfortable that I've probably put the correct figures in. Now the other thing I can do is I can then extend that gross profit to the side and operating profit to the side, and then when I do these steps, these are going to calculate by themselves. It doesn't matter which order I populate things, and there are probably going to be some that are a bit simpler and some that are a bit more difficult. It tells us assumptions 3 and 4 remain valid, and that was that selling and distribution will be a fixed percentage of revenue. Well, we haven't got revenue. Admin costs will be fixed. Well, we have got that. That's 1150. So I'm just going to put equals 1150 for that first one. And then I'll drag that across. That's probably given me at least half a mark just for doing the admin cost all the way through. So what else do we get told? We're told that the compound growth in revenue is now 2% per quarter. So that's quite an easy one for me to do. Again, I'm going to use the spreadsheet, the revenue from the quarter, the actuals, multiplied by 1.02. And by using that, again, I can drag that across, and that populates it for me. So the cost of sales, we need to work out, because it tells us, sorry, it was up here, the gross profit margin. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. So there was an increase in raw material price, so the gross profit margin is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to do a little side working. You don't have to. You could do it into the spreadsheet here, but I'm just going to do the cost of sales here, just so it's easier to see what I've done if you download this spreadsheet later and have a look at it. So the cost of sales in the actuals is 5568 over 9,600. So I'm just going to do that one divided by that one. So this tells me my cost of sales is 58% of revenue. So now I can do the cost of sales as 58% multiplied by the revenue. So that's worked it out for this quarter. Now, because I've only got this one as a single figure, if I drag that across, it will pick up the following cells. And you probably know this. What you can do is use the dollar symbol to lock this blue one. And so you need to put a dollar in front of the B in this one and after. And now when I drag it across, you'll see when I highlight that, it's picked up the revenue for each quarter, but it's stuck with this cell here. So it's now done all of that calculation for me. And then finally, we need selling and distribution. Again, I'm going to do a side working for that. And it tells us that the selling and distribution is a fixed percentage of revenue, and it tells us that remains valid. So the selling and distribution was 480 divided by revenue, and that tells us it's 5%. And so I'm just going to do exactly like I did for the previous step. This is a fixed percentage of revenue. And then I'm going to use that dollar trick to lock the cell B14. So that's part A done. And one of the questions is whether you should do the total for the budget. So whether we should do another total column. Because it didn't ask us to, I would think there's probably not any marks there. But then in the question, they have got a total. So I think it's probably good practice. It may be there is half a mark there. So we can do that quite simply just by doing the sum. Make sure we only pick up the 4 budgeted columns. And I could drag that down, turn those to bold, and I've very quickly done that. I think given the time it took to do that, I would do that in the exam, but it's a little bit questionable on whether there was a mark or even half a mark for that. But anyway, that's part A done. And hopefully we've picked up some key things around rolling budgets. Make sure you are looking into the question and asking yourself what has changed. So it's quite typical to have a budget as we've been given here, and some assumptions as we've been given here, and then things have changed. So you need to identify what's changed and make sure you apply the changed narrative into your rolling budget. What hasn't changed, and then you're copying that from the original assumption. So now we're going to go on to part B, which is the labour cost of producing the second batch of this log. Now, learning curve, you are given the formula. This is the formula sheet. So you're told that y equals ax to the b, and it tells you what each of those symbols stand for. The word in here is often a bit clunky, the cumulative average time to produce X units. A lot of people have to pause and really think about that. Y is really just the average time per unit based on the number of units you're looking at in that calculation. The word in here I think is a little bit clunky. Anyway, the approach I like for learning curve is to use, I call it the horizontal approach. I'll just put the formula up here just so we don't have to keep jumping back. And I just write a small table out for each of these. And what we're told is the first batch of this product, of this new lock, took 8,000 hours. And then we need to find or do the calculation, if you like, for the second batch. If it took 8,000 for the first batch, that tells us what A is, because A is the time taken for the first batch. X is the number of batches. Well, we want to find the second batch, so X is 2. B, fortunately, it gives it to us here, so that's minus 0.321928. And this is for the second batch. So if I calculate Y, I'm just going to now create this formula in this cell. So that equals the value of A multiplied by X to the B. You might wonder why I've done brackets. I probably use brackets more than you have to in spreadsheets, but I like to know I've got strict control of the order of operations. I think if I didn't use brackets, it would still work, this one, but I'm more comfortable not even thinking about it and just putting brackets in. That's up to you. If you're comfortable with the way the spreadsheet functionality works and that it will get the order of operations correct, then don't bother doing the brackets. It's just a personal preference from me. So what this now tells me is the average time for the first 2 batches is 6,400 hours. But I need the total time for the second batch. So if an average for 2 batches is 6,400, then multiplying by the number of batches gives me the total time. And then I need to take away the total time for the first batch. So I just copy and paste all of that in here. And I change that to 1. It changes the number for me. And then I find the difference of those two. And that tells me how many hours it took for the second batch. So just to run through that again, I've got my value of A is 8,000 because that's the time taken for the first batch. Here I'm looking at the first batch, so the value of X is 1. I've got my value of B, which it's given me down here, minus 0.321928. If they don't give that to you, it does tell you how to calculate it. It's the log of the learning rate divided by the log of 2, which again you can do in the spreadsheet. And then my calculation here works out the value of Y. 8,000 times 1 gives me 8,000. And then the second batch does exactly the same, except we've got the value of X is 2 because we're looking at the second batch. This is the time now for the second batch. The total time taken for both batches, batches 1 and 2, minus the time taken for the first batch gives us the time taken for the second batch. A lot of students end up using these figures, but make sure you do that next stage where you multiply by the number of batches to find the total time. That's a common error that we see. We need the labour cost, and it told us I've lost my mouse arrow. Here we go. It told us here that it's $12 per hour. So that tells us that the cost is $57,600. You can bold it. If you prefer, you can highlight it to make it clear where your answer is. But hopefully that neat layout is a really good way to do learning curve calculations when you're trying to find the time for a particular batch, or when you've got a steady state question, because all you end up having to change is the value of X and everything else sorts itself out. Okay, I'm just going to check that I haven't missed any questions. So bear with me a second while I just go and look at the chat function. There are a couple there. Bear with me a second. So I just want to see if I have covered them off already. Yeah, I think we've got those, so that's good, fine. Okay. So next is part C, so 3 weaknesses, and for each weakness, the extent that rolling budgets would address it. Now, I have written some of these out before, so you're not going to have to sit and watch me type. So bear with me a second while I get my answers, and I will share this after the session so you can see these. So there are probably several that you could pick up on. The first one I chose was that it uses an incremental approach. So let me put it here, what I put together earlier. So one of the weaknesses is that it uses incremental approach, which means it takes the previous budgeted figures and adjusts them for inflation. So that's the what. I'm saying what the problem is, but I haven't really said why that's a problem for Voltique, because that's not always a problem. For some companies, that's fine. A stable company, that's actually quite an appropriate way to do it. So what we need to do is make sure we link it back to this company. And that's where the next part of my answer there comes into play. I said it carries forward inefficiencies and out-of-date assumptions. And it's a poor fit for this company because of the rapid market. The market is changing fast. Therefore, a budgeting process that doesn't change fast isn't a good fit. The second part I need to say is, how will rolling budgets address this? So rolling budgets would address it because at each update, it's using the recent actual results and current market information. So it breaks that process of repeatedly carrying figures forward from the old budget. So what that means is the budget should reflect definitely more closely their current costs and their market conditions. And I want to really emphasize that when you are answering Section C narrative questions, make sure you are referring back to the narrative given you or the information given to you, unless it really is just a question that's just asking for definitions or just asking for technical knowledge. Here it specifically mentions Voltique, so we need to specifically refer to Voltique. And I do like this 2-sentence approach. So we use the first sentence, which is more of a generic thing. It's the generic problem here, or the generic way that rolling budgets can help. And then the second sentence on each part is how I link it directly to this company. And you'll see I use that pattern a lot. And it's a really good discipline to try and start using. So another problem I picked up on is fixed annual targets. So starting generically, fixed annual targets become impossible to hit once rivals entered the market. It's a little bit specific, that one, but I think that's fine. And then also, what happens if we have targets that are based on something that we know we can't achieve? If people don't believe them, do they? So they don't even bother trying if they know they can't achieve them. So that's what I've written on the second one, or the second sentence. How will rolling budgets change that? Well, rolling budgets update so it stays realistic. And what it then does, I've brought it back to this point that was made up here, where they invested, introduced this discount in here. Sales director felt like they should discount, takes that pressure away because we've now got a realistic target. And then the third one I've put in my answer is about decision making. I have got a typo there. It's decision making. Don't waste time correcting typos. The examiner knows what we're talking about. You don't get any marks for having perfect spelling. If you read a word, you've spelt it wrong. As long as it's obvious what word it is, just leave it alone. So in decision making, this now I'm actually going to want to talk about this 4 million expansion. So the decisions were based on old budget figures. That's a generic problem. The board spent 4 million on extra capacity whilst demand was already falling, and now that capacity sits idle, specific to this question. How do rolling budgets help? Well, choices would rest on the latest forecast. And in this company, by using budgets for planning and decision making, if those are current, then they'll make good decisions, for example, whether or not to make that investment. So those are 3 that I came up with. There are more. You could probably look at this and come up with others, as long as it's relevant, as long as you're answering the question, which is a weakness of the current process and the extent to which rolling budgets would address it, then that's fine. When you've got a question like this, make sure you use examples that you can use to answer both parts, because you could possibly pick up a weakness where rolling budgets don't help. So try to avoid putting that in, because you start to answer the question and then you leave yourself stuck. So make sure that whatever you put down here, you can cover off both parts of that question. Okay, so on to D now. We've got 3 marks and we're looking at difficulties of change into the new system. Whenever we change or think about changing a system, there are some things that we can almost always use. I see questions where we're discussing a change as a real gift, because there's often things we can talk about, such as IT, such as staff resistance, training costs. There's a few things we can mention, and they're almost always relevant to the question. So the first one I've talked about is that costs will rise because the budget is now reviewed quarterly rather than once a year. So that's ongoing work. So we're going to have a heavier reliance on managers supplying figures and on the finance team putting together that rolling budget. Another one I came up with, as I just mentioned, is skills. The previous system, there was this annual budget setting process, very simple, just an incremental, inflation adjusted change. Reforecasting properly every quarter is more complicated. It requires a high level of skill. And so we will possibly need to introduce training or incorporate or additional resource or something like that in order to make sure we've got the right level of expertise and understanding in order to do that. One thing I'm going to say is try to avoid combining points. So you could have put in here, or a lot of students would do something like skills and data, or they might talk about skills and IT together. I would say leave them separate, because if you talk about them separately, you're more likely to pick up a point for each. If you start to merge things like that, skills and IT, then you'll still get a mark. Whether you get the second mark is more questionable. And then the other great one you can almost always put when you've got a change is resistance. In general, people don't like change. So you can talk about resistance because of that element. But here we've actually got a bit more specificity that we can incorporate. And we've seen about the managers and their bonus. Well, maybe they think this is going to be a way to take that bonus away from them or make it harder for them to achieve bonus. So you could get some resistance because of that. And I've just put a small recommendation. Maybe the reward scheme will need to change alongside a change in budget. Before I do part E, I just want to sort of point out how much I've written there. I haven't written pages and pages or sentences and sentences. You see, almost routinely I do a pair of sentences and some white space, a pair of sentences and some white space. It's a tried and tested technique to get marks in Section C questions. Feel free to adopt it. It will not be suitable for every single Section C narrative, but probably something like 95% of Section C questions, you can use this sort of approach. The other thing I've tried to do, the thing I try and do is I try and start each sentence with the thing I'm talking about. And what do I mean by that? So this sentence I started with incremental budgeting. This one I started with rolling budgets. What I didn't start with is when we look at incremental budgeting, those 3 or 4 additional words, they don't add any value. They won't pick up any more marks, but it's more typing. It's stealing your valuable time. And this is a time restricted exam. So the less words or the fewer words you can write, the more time you've got to go and mop up marks elsewhere. So when you look at these later, maybe if you watch the recording or you you download my model answers, which is what these will be anyway, just take a look at my approach where I start with what I want to talk about. I try and use short words. I try not to say things like increases massively. I would just say increases or gets bigger. So again, try and avoid a lot of additional words, because although that might be what you do in normal life, if you were doing a normal report, for example, it doesn't help in PM. So you need to move away from what you would normally do to really focus on how to optimize getting marks in this paper. And then finally, we're just looking for 2 marks on the ERP system. This one is a little bit more sort of technical knowledge on how an ERP system works and what it has, but it did give us some hints in the question. Up here, it spoke about some bits that they weren't using, some functionality. So really, I'm just going to turn those around back into my answer. So dashboards give up-to-date sales figures for each quarterly reforecast. Automated data collection also reduces the manual work needed to prepare each update. So that's how the analytics capabilities could be used to improve the budgeting process. I've captured both elements of that. And then my last answer for part E, or my last answer for the question, I've picked up on the market data that it mentioned earlier. That shows competitor activity and input prices. How's that going to help improve budgeting? Well, we can use analytic tools to model events, and that should improve Voltique's plan for uncertain market, which we saw was one of the problems. You will see model answers from the examining team, which will be much longer than this, and they are often quite hard to get your head around. Just because the examiner does that doesn't mean it's the best way. I am always recommending to my students this sort of approach, using subheadings where relevant, short, succinct sentences, white space in the middle of each point. And what the examiner will do, or what the marker will do, is they'll look at this and they'll see I've got 3 headings. It's a 6-mark question, and they know that each heading therefore probably tries to get 2 marks, and they will see how I've split it up. And I'm basically taking the marker's hands and I'm walking them through step by step, effectively saying, please read this bit and then give me a mark. Now read this bit and give me a mark. It sounds a little bit odd, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do when I'm answering a Section C question. So that's a bit of a run through of this question. Hopefully you've picked up some good things there, some good hints and tips. And hopefully you can now reflect, if you had a go at this question, I hope you did, see what you did, compare what you did. Did you pick up on all the things I mentioned? Perhaps you picked up on other things. I won't be surprised. I'm not looking to try and produce a perfect answer here, just one that's a strong answer to mean that I come out getting some good marks. So I do have a few questions that came in before, and I'm just going to see if there's been any new ones come in whilst I've been talking. So bear with me 1 second, please. Okay, right. So I think I've just got the ones that came in before. Few key points, a few key recap points. When we're dealing with rolling budgets, make sure that you're always referring to that actuals, and then that sort of, there's a clue in the name, isn't there, that it rolls forward. So make sure that you get this baseline correct and how the next one references that baseline, and then make sure you follow it through correctly. That's easy marks if you get it right. So do make sure you do that. As I said earlier, with rolling budgets, when you have this sort of scenario with some assumptions, ask yourself what stayed the same, and then incorporate that. What's changed? How's it changed? And make sure you incorporate the changed methodology. Hopefully the learning curve bit that we went through here has helped a very efficient approach to do a learning curve calculation. As I said, Y is the average time. So this is the average time for the first batch. This is the average time per batch for batches 1 and 2, or the first 2 batches. Make sure you are turning it into total time when you're trying to find the time for a specific batch. Another thing, this part C over here, this wasn't looking for 6 separate points to be made. It was looking for you to pair your points up, the weakness and the extent to how rolling budgets could address that. So make sure that you look for that sort of question. If it just said discuss 3 weaknesses, and then maybe separately discuss how rolling budgets could help Voltique, then maybe you could do 3 points for each. But this clearly wanted them linked together. So look out for that wording. And make sure, it says for each weakness identified, discuss the extent. One thing here that you should be cautious of avoiding is don't oversell the benefit of a rolling budget. The rolling budget still relies on previous data. True to say that the previous data is better than they were using, but it still has some assumptions. Those assumptions may not be true. So don't be too overzealous with saying everything's going to be perfect, because that's not the case. There are still problems with rolling budgets. It should be more up to date, but it's still not necessarily going to be exactly the way things happen. Hopefully you saw as I went through these, I used some of my knowledge of budgets and rolling budgets and change, and then I made them specific to Voltique. I didn't just stop at that generic comment. I made sure I talked about how it was relevant to Voltique. Every so often you will get a question, which I didn't have here, but in other Section C questions, where it really is just technical knowledge. And there's no expectation then to link it back to the narrative, and often it is the last part of a Section C question, 2 or 3 or 4 marks, can sometimes just be a standalone technical knowledge question, in which case don't feel that need to link it back. You still need to give a good quality answer. If there is a link, fine, mention it, but you don't have to. But certainly if it tells you to, if it mentions the company, make sure you are, because if you don't, the less likely to give you marks. And I hope you saw that the discipline I used here of being succinct and short to the point, this comes with practice, making sure I'm not using filler words which don't add value. Don't worry too much about spelling as long as the word I've written makes sense and gets the point across. Certainly don't waste time correcting it. And in terms of layout, you see all I've used here is bold for the heading and then just normal text for the rest. And I wouldn't go much beyond that. With your calculations, you see I've used bold. I use bold here. The only other thing I do sometimes recommend to students is highlighting an answer like that, just because that helps the examiner. If you're friends with the examiner by being kind to them, they'll probably be your friend too. So I'm now going to go through the specific questions that were sent to me before. So one question was, do we include the actual Q1 figures in the rolling budget? Well, you don't have to. It doesn't ask you to. But I hope you've seen that the Q2 onwards is much easier by having Q1 there. And by putting Q1 there, I could use the spreadsheet to do the gross profit and the operating profit, which I can cross-check, make sure I've got it correct, and then that feels like a better way. So you don't have to, but I would, because I think it's a safer approach. Another question was about adding in Q1. Often students forget, they just do the 3 quarters to the end of the year. Always remember, with a rolling budget, it has that number of periods ahead. So this one, it told us that they're moving to a rolling budget, or looking at a rolling budget. They're looking at a rolling budget for the next 4 quarters. Make sure you include the next 4 quarters. If you leave this one off, you will get fewer marks. Let me just read the next question. So this question was about whether to use this Q2. Sorry. Let me read that again. Okay, so whether to use the assumptions that were given at the beginning to do the first bit, and then to do Q2, that is, and then use the new assumptions. So hopefully we'll cover that. No, those assumptions are triggered immediately, and I hopefully when you read this bit, you would see the sales director now considers compound growth of 2% per quarter applied to Q1's actual revenue. So the question has also helped us out there. If it didn't have that, I would assume that anyway. Let me read them. There's a few more that I've got to go through. There was a question about whether, well, I guess it was asking or recognizing that this 2% compounds, and it does, because it's 2% on what was previously grown by 2%. And that's the correct approach, because it does tell us that it's a compound growth of 2% per quarter. If the question was worded differently, it may be that this would be the correct calculation, whereas this would be 4% of Q1 and this would be 6% of Q1. So a non-compounding approach, but make sure you read the question and answer what it tells you. So this next question was around the learning curve. Is the 8,000 hours the time for the first batch or the average time per batch? In this scenario, it's both, because the first batch took 8,000 hours, so it's the actual time for that batch. But because there's only one batch, it's also the average. 8,000 divided by 1 is 8,000. So the answer there is yes to both. It's the average time and the total time, or the cumulative time. Next question, can I use the fixed annual budget being out of date as a weakness and unrealistic targets as another, or are they the same point? So I think they're different points. As long as you separate them, make sure you distinguish them separately. So the annual budget is out of date because it's not updated when conditions change. And that creates unrealistic targets, which can drive dysfunctional behavior. So yeah, I think you can do those separately. Don't overthink it. If you can think of a completely different example, use that rather than risk possibly repeating yourself. Another question was around a lack of manager involvement as a weakness. Yes, it is a weakness of the current system, but I don't think the way this question was framed that that rolling budget solved that, because it didn't really emphasize that the managers would be involved in budget setting. So I don't think I would choose to use it for part C because it's a weakness, but does this rolling budget improve it? Probably not. Whereas if the managers were involved in setting the rolling budgets, then that buy-in from those managers is more likely to be an improvement as a result of this rolling budget recommendation. So that's all the questions. What I will do is I will, you probably got to this from a link from my website. I will upload the answers and this spreadsheet onto my onto that page, so you'll be able to download those and have copies yourself. If you go to this QR code, you'll be able to, that will take you to my website to get those. I'll probably do it tomorrow because it's quite late now and it's been a full-on day. So thank you for joining. It's been a pleasure having you all here. Good luck if you're sitting in September. Good luck. If you are interested in any of my courses, do go to this QR code. You'll see what I offer. Like I say, I've got a revision and mock course that's active at the moment. It will close soon, but you can still join at this stage. I'd just like to wish you all the best of luck. PM's a tough exam, but do persevere, and hopefully what you've seen today will really help you. I do this sort of thing with my students for a few times. So we've got live sessions like this, looking at specific questions, going through like I've did. That's one of the things I do on my revision courses, along with marking, giving specific feedback. So lots of benefits that I can offer you. But once again, good luck, and thanks very much. I now have a private session with my students, so I need to jump onto that. So I will end this meeting, but thanks everyone for joining.